Michael Dowd here. This is the beta version of a 8-part discussion course for secular and religious study groups. Ecology as Theology, Inspiring Science for Challenging Times. The Prodigal Species Comes Home. The first session is Un-trivializing God, an I-thou relationship to reality is not optional. Session 2, the evolutionary purpose of religion and religious necessity of science. Session 3, Big Green History, or the Epic of Evolution, the cosmic 101-year timeline. Session 4, Thus Saith Reality, Evidentially, what's inevitable, what's futile, what's pro-future. Session 5, Mismatched Instincts, Why We Struggle, Un-trivializing Mythic Wisdom. Session 6, Impermanence and Death as Sacred, Legacy as the Final Meaning of Life. Session 7, Staying Sane, Sober, and Inspired in Chaotic and Contracting Times. And Session 8, Pro-Future versus Anti-Future Faith, Reality's Rules for Redeeming Humanity. So let's take a look at this notion of untrivializing or realizing God. An I-thou relationship to reality is not optional. Loyal Rue is one of the leading philosophers of religion alive, and one of his books is called Religion is Not About God. And what he means is that religion is about our relationship to reality. And yes, reality has been personalized or personified as the Lord in monotheistic traditions and as the various gods and goddesses in polytheistic traditions. But if religion's doing its job, it's to help us live in right relationship to what's fundamentally, undeniably, and inescapably real. I love this quote. The most profound insight in the history of humankind is that we should seek to live in accord with reality. Indeed, living in harmony with reality may be accepted as a formal definition of wisdom. If we live at odds with reality, foolishly, we will be doomed. But if we live in proper relationship with reality, wisely, we shall be saved. Now, whatever else it means to live in right relationship to reality, it's got to include living in right relationship to the air, the water, the soil, and the life of this planet. It's also got to include living in right relationship to future generations. So I dedicate this series, this course, to Isla Renee, my granddaughter, and to her grandchildren. So this notion of ecology as the heart of theology, or ecology as theology, the term that captures that is ecotheism. And ecotheism transcends previous godisms because it's fact-based, it's evidence-based, it's not belief-based. St. Thomas Aquinas said 750 years ago that a mistake about creation will necessarily result in a mistake about God. Now, what that means, among other things, is the more we learn about the nature of the universe, the more we learn about the nature of reality, if we're not updating what we mean when we even use the word God, we may have definitions and understandings of God that are so outdated they're no longer life-giving. In fact, they may be deadly. So ecotheism is about deep sustainability. It's the opposite of shallow environmentalism. It's the shift from human-centeredness to life-centeredness. And the visual image that I want to make sure that we keep in our minds is nested reality, nested creativity, nested divinity. We now know, we don't believe this, we know that subatomic particles are within atoms, within molecules, within cells, within organisms, within planets, within galaxies. And those at every nested level, creativity exists. Hydrogen and oxygen come together, water's created. Stars create the very periodic table of elements. And we know this. And so this image of nested reality within other spheres of larger nested reality. Now, obviously, this is more complex, but we're in the middle somewhere. We're made up of smaller creative realities, like our microbiome, the bacteria, the creatures inside of us that we couldn't exist without. But we're also part of larger systems that we are also utterly dependent upon for our existence. For example, the trees and the algae and the plants and animals. So larger realities and smaller realities. And you could imagine this going infinite in either direction, that primary reality are all those aspects of reality, non-human reality, that we depend upon for our existence, for our survival and thrival. And we need to live in right relationship to primary reality or we suffer. It's the opposite of the mechanistic worldview, this idea that nature is a complex clock and God is the clockmaker outside. What that did about 500 years ago is it trivialized God, God was no longer synonymous with reality. God was now a being outside reality that if you believed in, you were a theist, and if you disbelieved, you were an atheist. And yet both sides treat the living, pulsing presence of the biosphere as an it that we think we can exploit for our benefit without consequence, and nothing could be further from the truth. And Martin Buber, the famous Jewish theologian, said decades ago that if we continue to relate to primary reality as an it that we think we can exploit rather than a thou to be honored and respected, we will cause our own extinction. So this is the fundamental belief system, this fundamental reality, that primary reality must be honored as primary. Every sustainable culture in human history knew that. Every unsustainable culture forgets that. So, ecotheism, ecology as the heart of theology. The counter to that, or the flip side of that, is that human-centeredness, human-centered hubris specifically, must be considered idolatry. This idea of man, conqueror of nature, is the single most self-destructive thought form probably in human history. My two great mentors, William Catton and Thomas Berry. William Catton is the author of Overshoot, the ecological basis of revolutionary change, which is the single most important book that Connie and I have ever read in our lives. Many people consider that. In fact, many people consider it the most important book of the 20th century. Thomas Berry called himself a geologian, not a theologian. He was a Catholic priest. He was a monk. He was a cultural historian. And his book, The Dream of the Earth and The Great Work, are two of the most important ecological books of the 20th century. Catton writes, human society is inextricably part of a global biotic community. And in that community, human dominance has had and is having self-destructive consequences. Thomas Berry, along similar lines, says the most difficult transition to make is from an anthropocentric or human-centered to a biocentric or life-centered norm of progress. If there is to be any true progress, the entire life community must progress. Any so-called progress of the human at the expense of the larger life community must ultimately lead to a diminishment of human life itself. So, of course, human-centeredness needs to be considered idolatry. So when religion succumbs to human-centeredness, that is idolatry, we inevitably confuse good and evil. We can't not. And demonic economics is a predictable result. I love this cartoon. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. Now, why have we done this? Well, this quote captures really the essence of this entire course, can be summed up in this quote from Thomas Berry. We are talking only to ourselves. We are not talking to the rivers. We are not listening to the wind and the climate. Most of the disasters that are happening now are a consequence of that spiritual autism. Now, I think the reason we've been spiritually autistic in his language, or as I would say, that we've been blind and deaf to what reality God has been revealing for centuries through evidence, is that we haven't appreciated our brain's propensity to give human characteristics to what's more than human, what's other than human. I consider it one of the most important scientific discoveries about religion in the last several hundred years. Now, Wendell Berry understood the power of personification. He said, nature is party to all our deals and decisions, and she has more votes, a longer memory, and a sterner sense of justice than we do. James Hillman, one of the leading psychologists of the last 70 years, said, you can't even understand the world's myths and religions if you don't understand our brain's propensity to give human characteristics to what's more than human, to personify. He said, loving is a way of knowing, and for love to know, it must personify. Personifying is thus the heart's mode of knowing. It's not a lesser, primitive way of apprehending, but a finer one. To enter myth, we must personify, and to personify carries us into myth. Now, he's using myth not as an untrue story. He's using it the way that Joseph Campbell did, a narrative that puts us in accord with the nature of reality. And you'll see throughout this course, I quote a lot of people because I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, some of the leading psychological, ecological, environmental, and scientific thinkers and theological thinkers of the last 50, 60 years. Now, fortunately, Hollywood and Conservation International have gotten the memo on personification in a big way. They've teamed up, and there's now about 15 or 16 of these 1 or 2 minute videos where some Hollywood star personifies some aspect of reality, and you feel the power of personification in this process. So here's Julia Roberts not speaking about nature. She's nature speaking.
Some call me nature. Others call me Mother Nature. I've been here for over 4.5 billion years, 22,500 times longer than you. I don't really need people, but people need me. Yes, your future depends on me. When I thrive, you thrive. When I falter, you falter. Or worse. But I've been here for eons. I have fed species greater than you, and I have starved species greater than you. My oceans, my soil, my flowing streams, my forests, they all can take you or leave you. How you choose to live each day, whether you regard or disregard me, doesn't really matter to me. One way or the other. Your actions will determine your fate, not mine. I am nature. I will go on. I am prepared to evolve. Are you?
Now notice how different that stance is, that nature doesn't need people, people need nature, from the idea that nature is some kind of cute bunny that needs our protection. It's a profound shift. So I encourage you to go to natureisspeaking.org, watch all of them, because they're prophetic, they're powerful. And of course, God's voice includes all of these. Otherwise, it's not reality that we're talking about. For example, we don't know of a single culture anywhere in the world that didn't personify or personalize what the climate was doing as either divine blessing or divine judgment. This is all cultures throughout human history have done this. And it's not a surprise. I mean, can you think of any force in the universe that more consistently brings cultures into being, sustains them, and destroys them than climate? So, right relationship to reality is what ultimately matters for all species. And this is just as true for humans. We live in right relationship to reality or we suffer, individually and collectively. And words create worlds, and language changes, often dramatically over time. For example, what to call this? That which brought life into being, that which nourishes and sustains life, and that which receives life at its end. You don't have to believe in this. This is inescapable reality. But what do we call it? Well, what we call reality, what we call nature, what we call the universe, sustainable cultures, ancient cultures experienced personally and honored in an I-thou way as primary reality. Whatever their name or names, creator, great spirit, whatever, they related to primary reality as primary. I love this quote from Thomas Berry. The environment is not our surroundings, it's our source, sustenance, and end. There are no human farmers like this in existence in the universe. There are only farmers like this, who breathe, who eat, who poop. In other words, we are part of larger systems that we rely on utterly. A human farmer has no existence outside primary reality, whether we call that reality the environment or God or goddess or something else. So, as I'll be using this in this course, I'll be spelling God, capital G-O-D, or small caps G-O-D, or the Old English spelling G-O-D-D-E, as a number of Catholic nuns and feminists are doing, partly because it's gender neutral, but also it's the Old English spelling of God. And what we're meaning is reality with a personality, not a person outside reality. And it doesn't matter whether you believe in reality or not. But I can always count on, whenever I do programs in college and university classrooms, I can always count on some philosophy major, usually, who tries to trip me up and say, well, what do you mean by reality? And I love Philip K. Dick's definition. He says, reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. And whatever else that means, it includes time and nature. Time and nature are real whether we believe in them or not. And the reason I say time plus, nature plus, is because if you want to have any supernatural or otherworldly beliefs, that's fine. But God has got to include time and include nature. So, God includes the real presence and guidance of the past, present, and future. What the past is telling us is God's word. What the future is calling us to do is divine guidance. And of course, the only place we can be a blessing or a curse to the future is in the present. And the power, collective intelligence, and voice of the universe plus. Again, plus at least a voice, but plus whatever else you want to believe in terms of supernatural or otherworldly, that's fine. But God has got to include the power, the collective intelligence, and the voice of the universe. And again, this becomes obvious when we think of the nesting dolls. We're in the middle somewhere. Primary reality is everything within us and everything around us that we utterly depend upon. And of course, human-centeredness, that is pursuing only our own self-interest and taking primary reality for granted, is going to lead to our own destruction. This is obvious when we think about it. For example, I'm going to use secular language and religious language, and you're going to see both are totally legitimate. You can't understand how reality or God created complex life if you don't understand extinctions. You can't understand how reality or God created the Great Lakes or soil in the northern part of the world if you don't understand glaciers. You can't understand how God or reality created the periodic table of elements or planets or life or even the atoms of our bodies if you don't understand red giants and supernova explosions. Watch this photo carefully. You surely can't understand how God or reality created continents and oceans and mountains if you don't understand plate tectonics. See, we don't believe that the Atlantic Ocean is growing at the same rate that our fingernails grow. We know it. We've got the satellites to measure exactly how fast the Atlantic Ocean is growing and how fast the Pacific Ocean is shrinking. This is evidential revelation. So my second TEDx talk was on this topic, reality reconciles science and religion, because the word reality didn't exist 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. So what we mean by reality was captured by mythic language. And about a week before this event, I noticed they had a typo on their website. It said, Reverend Michael Dowd, reality, reconciles science and religion. So I told them that they had the colon in the wrong place, but I said, I got to tell you, I like this Reverend reality thing. And they said, well, we do too. And my publicist said, Bill Nye, the science guy, Michael Dowd, Reverend reality, we're running with this thing. And so the next day I went online and I put Celtic green clergy shirts, and I found these long sleeve and short sleeve green clergy shirts. So now it's like my regalia. I become Reverend reality. I just love it. I consider the theism versus atheism debate to be a form of collective insanity. You've got thousands, maybe millions of people debating whether or not God is real or whether or not God exists, when the one real God, namely reality, personified or not, we've been living out of right relationship to, and we are now about to experience consequences of biblical proportion. And you got people debating whether or not God is real. It's insane. Post-theism, too, makes sense only if you start with an idolatrous, that is an impotent, finite, otherworldly notion of God. No sane person would smugly say, I'm a post-realist, or I don't believe in the universe, or don't be superstitious, reality doesn't exist. I have religious people complain to me sometimes, whine about they're being beaten up by atheists. And my response is always the same. Stop using a trivial notion of God. Of course they're going to be beating on you. They should. See, there's a profound difference between an unnatural God, that is, God thought of as a supernatural patriarch, God is an otherworldly clockmaker, and an undeniable God, reality with a personality. So again, memorize this slide throughout this entire course. God, all caps, God, small caps, and G-O-D-D-E, Old English spelling. I'll be using all three of those. And what I'm meaning is reality with a personality. Any God that is not synonymous with reality deserves to be rejected and mocked, as the post-theists and atheists do so well. But ecotheism transcends the theist-atheist debate. It honors the ecosphere and the cosmos as divine. It fosters humility rather than hubris. It celebrates our personification instinct. It evolves rather than derides tradition. And it facilitates religion's evolutionary and ecological reason for being. And I'll say a lot more about that in the next session. Post-theism does none of these essential things, and they are essential for human survival. And of course, atheism doesn't either. In fact, a friend of mine who just died recently, Mark Perkel, on both YouTube and Vimeo, has a sermon that he delivered in a humanist setting. He was on the board of the humanist community of Silicon Valley. And his sermon is titled, Why Reality Needs a Religion and Why Atheism Isn't Good Enough. So I want to honor the memory of Mark and his Church of Reality. We discovered each other after he had done a lot of work on this Church of Reality, and he was a tireless advocate of an evidence-based religious perspective. My favorite one-line piece of scripture: science is, at least in part, informed worship. Here's my contact information and websites. Again, this is a beta version. Any and all suggestions for improvement are welcome, whether type font or content or anything else. Thank you.